The restaurant was silent long before anyone realized why. Forks froze mid-air, champagne lost its bubbles, and conversations died on trembling lips. In the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, a boy with legs bound in metal braces reached out a shaking hand, and not for pity, not for help, but for a dance. And when the waitress, the one the world never noticed, placed her hand in his broken bar, everything changed. The silence that fell over Kingsley's, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, was so heavy it pressed down on the velvet-draped walls and crystal chandeliers. Conversations that had moments ago been filled with laughter and business deals stopped mid-sentence. Cutlery hovered above fine china, frozen in place. Every gaze turned to the small patch of space between the tables where something unexpected was unfolding. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery stood trembling. His thin legs, encased in rigid metal braces, shook with the effort of standing. His hand extended shakily, reaching for someone few would ever have expected him to notice. Diana Johnson, the restaurant's only black waitress, paused mid-step with her serving tray. She blinked at him in surprise, her dark eyes flicking toward his outstretched fingers, then to his father, and finally to the manager glaring from the corner. The live piano in the corner had just begun to weave a slow, graceful melody. To Lucas, it wasn't background music, it was an invitation. For 2 years since the car accident that had partially paralyzed his legs, he had lived in hospitals, therapy rooms, and behind the walls of his father's penthouse, where silence was the rule and expectations were whispered like warnings. Yet tonight, in this glittering palace of power and wealth, the music tugged at something inside him. Without thinking, he asked. Not with words, he didn't dare, but with a trembling hand held out to a stranger. "Sir, control your son." Manager Thornton's voice sliced through the moment, cold and sharp. His jaw tightened as he hissed at the billionaire seated at the table. "That's inappropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." Richard Montgomery, owner of Montgomery Investments, one of the richest men in America, felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. It was the first time he had taken his son out in public since the accident. Already, it felt like a mistake he would never repeat. "Lucas, sit down," he ordered, his tone low but firm, a command rather than a plea. The boy hesitated, his hand still suspended in the air, his pale fingers trembling with both weakness and hope. He wanted so desperately for someone to take it. Diana's throat tightened. In her 5 years at Kingsley's, she had mastered the art of being invisible. She had trained herself to glide silently between the elite, never intruding, never existing beyond the function of service. But tonight was different. The boy's eyes were pleading, fragile, and yet carrying a kind of strength she recognized from her own struggles. She could have turned away. She should have turned away. Thornton was watching her like a hawk. Richard Montgomery's expression warned of ruin for anyone who dared cross him. But Diana slowly untied the apron from her waist, folded it neatly, and placed it on the tray. "My shift is over," she said calmly, though her heart pounded. The manager stiffened. "Diana." But before he could stop her, she bent down slightly, offering a soft smile to Lucas. "I can't dance in an apron." And she took his hand. Richard surged to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "What do you think you're doing?" Her gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Accepting an invitation, sir." And before anyone could interfere, Lucas shuffled forward. The braces on his legs screeched against the polished floor as he dragged one foot. Diana didn't rush him, didn't correct him. She matched his pace, slow and imperfect. The restaurant watched in stunned silence. "She's getting fired tomorrow," a woman at the next table whispered behind her jeweled fingers. Richard's throat constricted. The memory came unbidden, sharp and working of Elizabeth, his late wife, twirling Lucas across their living room rug, laughter echoing through the house. "It's not about perfection," she had whispered to him back then, her eyes shining. "It's about connection." Now, in this place of power and privilege, Richard watched as Diana let his son lead 3 small, clumsy steps. Yet in those steps, something remarkable bloomed. Fear melted into concentration. Shame shifted into pride. For the first time since the accident, Lucas wasn't being corrected, guided, or pitied. He was leading. Mr. Montgomery, Manager Thornton interrupted, desperate to repair the situation. This will never happen again. She'll be disciplined. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Lucas's face, glowing with fragile triumph. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed against him. Customers, employees, critics in silk gowns and sharp suits are all waiting to see how the billionaire would respond. Diana gently led Lucas back to his table, bowed slightly as if addressing royalty, and said softly, "Thank you for asking me out. It was an honor." She turned to leave, but Richard's voice, rough and unfamiliar to his own ears, stopped her. "Wait. What's your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." Richard repeated it under his breath, as if carving it into memory. Then he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a business card, holding it toward her. "My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. The restaurant held its breath. Diana accepted the card without expression, but her hand trembled slightly. "Dad." Lucas's small voice broke the silence as she walked away. "Why did you do that?" The question hung between them, heavier than the chandelier above. Richard stared at his son, and for a fleeting second, he didn't see the fragile child he pitied or the responsibility he had resented. He saw a boy, a complete human being, who wanted, who asked, who led. Dinner passed in silence, the food untouched. No one noticed the way Diana glanced back once before leaving, not with fear, not with resignation, but with a quiet determination that contrasted the storm building inside Richard Montgomery's mind. The following morning, Montgomery Tower glittered in the sun, its marble and glass walls reflecting the city like a fortress of wealth. Diana Johnson stood in the lobby, clutching her worn purse against her chest. Her best outfit, a navy skirt and a white blouse bought on sale, looked out of place among the sharp suits and luxury handbags around her. She caught a glimpse of herself in the polished steel of the elevator and lifted her chin. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she told the receptionist, who scanned her with practiced indifference before dialing a number. "18th floor. Miss Winters will see you." The elevator ride felt endless. Diana's pulse quickened, but fear didn't drive it. She had faced worse in her life than a man with too much money. Determination steadied her breathing. Miss Winters, Richard's assistant, was a sharp woman in her 40s with a gaze that sliced through pleasantries. She escorted Diana down mirrored hallways where employees' eyes followed her curiously, murmurs flickering behind closed doors. "You know why you're here?" Winters said suddenly, without turning her head. "Because Mr. Montgomery invited me." Winters's lips curved faintly. "He had you fired, didn't he?" "That's what usually happens. Clients complain. People like you lose their jobs." "People like me?" "You know what I mean." "No," Diana said evenly. "But I'd love to hear you explain." Winters stiffened, pushing open a door. "He'll see you now." Richard Montgomery's office sprawled across half the floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows turning Manhattan into a miniature kingdom. He stood at the glass, hands clasped behind his back. The city stretched beneath him like property. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana greeted, formal but unshaken. He turned, his face composed into something practiced, unreadable. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming. Please, sit." The silence that followed was calculated. Diana recognized it immediately. It was the kind of silence meant to unnerve, to make the other person fill it with words. She let it linger, unbroken. Finally, Richard spoke. "Do you have a background?" "Excuse me?" "Education." "College." Her gaze didn't waver. "Bachelor's degree in child development." "No." "Incomplete master's in special education." Something flickered across his expression, a crack in the mask. "And yet you work as a waitress." "I work 3 jobs," she corrected. "The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I can." Richard crossed to his desk, picking up a folder. "I did some research on you, Miss Johnson. I wanted to understand who the person was. Broken bar danced with my son." He opened the folder. Photographs slid across the table. Children smiling in wheelchairs. Hand-painted banners. A sign, Freedom Steps. You founded this 6 years ago. I co-founded it with my sister, a dance program for children with disabilities. It's about to close due to lack of funding. She showed no surprise. Of course, he would know everything in less than 24 hours. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Montgomery. Then why did you come? Because you invited me. Richard's laugh was short, empty. Fair enough. He shifted restlessly. I want you to work for me. Diana blinked. As a waitress? In your house? His jaw tightened. As a therapeutic companion for Lucas. Even saying his son's name seemed to cost him. His eyes darted briefly to a framed photograph on his desk. A woman with kind eyes holding a baby. Elizabeth. I have the best specialists, Richard went on. Therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did last night, a broken bar. He stopped, almost choking on the admission. It was just a dance, Diana said softly. It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident. The words hung there, naked and painful. I don't want a dancer for my son, Richard continued. I want someone who can do what you did, follow, not lead. Diana studied him. Beneath the polished armor of control and wealth, she saw it. A desperate, lost father. I'll pay you 5 times what you make now. Diana stood. Number. His face froze, as though no one had dared say that word to him in decades. I don't work for men who see my color or my class before they see my competence, she explained quietly. And I don't work for people who think money can buy solutions to problems of the heart. You're turning down a fortune out of pride, out of dignity. She stepped toward the door. And because your son deserves more than someone you hired to pretend to care. Richard flushed with anger. You don't know my son. No, she agreed. But I know people like him. People whose bodies carry limits but whose spirits are caged more by others than by their own strength. She placed a card on his desk. Freedom Steps. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Lucas, the first class is free. And she left him there, staring at the card like it was an indictment. The Bronx was alive that Wednesday afternoon, its streets pulsing with the rhythms of daily struggly vendors calling out over crates of fruit, children playing tag around hydrants, the screech of buses fighting traffic. Tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered hardware store stood the old warehouse that Diana and her sister Zoe had claimed years ago. Freedom Steps was written in peeling paint above the door, each letter hand-drawn by the children who had once helped launch the program. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed with sweat, tears, and imagination. Posters made from poster board and cheap markers hung on the walls. Your rhythm, your rules. Every move counts. Dances for everybody. The floor was worn but polished clean each week. Mirrors donated by a closing ballet studio reflected not perfection but determination. Diana sat behind a desk cluttered with donation jars and attendance sheets when Zoe came rushing in, hijab slightly askew from the summer wind. Diana, she whispered sharply, half breathless. There's a Bentley parked outside. Diana didn't look up from the attendance book. Probably lost. No, Dee, you don't understand. There's a Bentley parked outside. And you won't believe who's sitting in it. Diana finally lifted her gaze. Zoe's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and dread. She pushed the curtain aside and peeked through the cracked glass of the window. Sure enough, the glossy black Bentley gleamed on their street like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong universe. Lucas was in the back seat, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. His braces gleamed in the sunlight, catching every curious glance of children walking home from school. In the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as though it were a lifeline, sat Richard Montgomery. His tailored jacket was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and trousers. But the cut of the clothes, the watch on his wrist, the tension in his shoulders all betrayed a man not used to this environment. He's not coming in, Zoe muttered, shaking her head. Men like him don't come into places like this. They send chauffeurs, assistants, PR people. But him? Number. Diana's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. Don't underestimate the power of a determined son. As if on cue, Lucas opened the car door slowly. His braces clicked against the pavement as he struggled to climb out. He turned toward the building, eyes wide, hesitant but burning with hope. Richard didn't move. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. But then, after a pause long enough to make Zoe scoff again, he opened his own door and stepped out. The billionaire looked oddly vulnerable standing on that cracked sidewalk, his polished shoes dusted with city grit. It was clear he had dressed deliberately casual, no tie, no cufflinks, no silk pockets square. And yet, privilege clung to him like a second skin. Zoe hissed, "He actually came." "I told you," Diana murmured. Her voice wasn't smug. It was filled with quiet certainty. "What did you do to him?" Zoe whispered. Diana didn't answer. Her eyes never left Lucas, who was making his slow, careful way toward the entrance, every step an act of courage. Inside, the children were already moving. A girl in a wheelchair spun herself in slow circles, arms extended like wings. A boy with a prosthetic leg tapped out an improvised rhythm against the wooden floor. A child with crutches balanced carefully, experimenting with shifts of weight. It was messy, chaotic, loud. It was freedom. When Lucas stepped inside, his breath caught. His world until now had been therapists with clipboards, sterile hospital rooms, and a father's eyes that flinched every time he stumbled. Here, stumbling wasn't failure. It was part of the music. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana greeted as she approached, wearing the program's simple t-shirt and loose pants. "Welcome." Richard's eyes swept the room with discomfort. "It looks chaotic." "There is structure," Diana replied evenly. "Just not the kind you're used to." She crouched down to meet Lucas's gaze. "Would you like to join?" Lucas's eyes lit up, then flickered uncertainly to his father. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to say number. He wanted to protect his son from embarrassment, from pain, from disappointment. But the memory of that smile at Kingsley's still haunted him. "Go on," he said stiffly. "I'll be right here." Diana extended her hand. Lucas took it, stepping hesitantly onto the dance floor. As they moved into the circle of children, Zoe approached Richard with a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she said gently. "For the parents, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," Richard muttered, defensive. "I've hired the best specialists in the country." "And how has that been working for Lucas?" Zoe asked softly. He didn't answer. The studio door opened, and heads turned. An older woman entered, leaning on an ornate cane. Her silver hair was braided elegantly, her stride deliberate, her presence commanding. Children rushed to greet her. Zoe leaned toward Richard. "Dr. Elaine Mercer, neuroscientist, retired from Harvard. She oversees our research program." Richard stiffened. "Dr. Mercer, I've rejected your funding proposals 3 times. And yet here you are," she said with a small smile, her eyes sharp. "Welcome to Freedom Steps." Richard's jaw clenched. "I thought this was just a community dance class." "We're studying how non-directive movement approaches affect neuroplasticity in children with motor impairments," Dr. Mercer explained. "It's both therapy and freedom. You'll see." Richard turned sharply toward Diana, who had just returned after guiding Lucas to a group of children. "Why do you work as a waitress if you're running this program?" "Because we don't have the funding," Diana replied simply. "Because when people like you dismissed us, I still had to pay the rent." Richard's voice dropped into accusation. "You knew who I was that night at the restaurant." "From the moment you walked in," Diana admitted. "But I didn't plan Lucas's invitation. That was his choice. I simply chose to follow." Before Richard could respond, the sound of camera shutters filled the room. Reporters had arrived, snapping photos of children moving across the floor. Richard tensed, fury flashing in his eyes. "What is this?" "Part 2 of the plan," Diana said calmly. Zoe handed Richard a newspaper hot off the press. The headline read, "Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation Methodology Shows Promising Results." "We published our preliminary findings today," Dr. Mercer explained, "and invited the press to see for themselves." "You used my son for a publicity stunt," Richard hissed. Diana met his glare with steady eyes. "Your son chose to dance. We chose to let the world see what that means." She led him into a side room. Photos lined the walls of children with braces, prosthetics, wheelchairs each with handwritten notes documenting progress, smiles, achievements, small steps that meant the world. At the end of the wall was an empty frame. "What's that for?" Richard asked, his voice harsh. "Our future," Diana said quietly, "a full rehabilitation center. Hundreds of children each year instead of dozens. You orchestrated this. The dance, the meeting, the press. You manipulated me." Diana didn't deny it. "I saw an opportunity. I took it. Because you ignored us 3 times before." Before Richard could reply, Zoe's voice pierced the tension. "Diana, it's Lucas." They rushed back into the studio. The music had stopped. Everyone had formed a circle. Lucas stood in the center, trembling, his face pale but determined. He had unbuckled one of his braces. "Lucas." Richard started forward, panic rising. Diana caught his arm. "Wait. Watch." The boy took a deep breath, focusing hard. He shifted his weight, lifted his weak leg, and slowly, painfully took a step. A complete step. It was small, shaky, imperfect, but it was his. The children erupted in cheers. Camera flashes went wild. Lucas beamed, chest heaving with pride. Richard's world cracked. For 2 years, he had been told impossible. For 2 years, he had believed it. Now, here was his son, proving them all wrong, in front of strangers, in front of the press, in front of him. Tears stung his eyes. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Diana said softly beside him. "Not for perfect steps, for first steps, on their own." Richard swallowed hard, his throat thick. Reporters surged closer. "Mr. Montgomery," one called, "your foundation rejected this program 3 times. Do you regret that decision?" Richard's eyes flicked to Lucas, still glowing with joy. Then, for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to say the words he had never said in public. "You know what's hardest for someone in my position?" He turned to the crowd, his voice strong enough to carry. "Admitting when we're wrong." The room fell into stunned silence. "The Montgomery Foundation will fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years," Richard continued, "and build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology of Dr. Mercer and Miss Johnson. On one condition: Miss Johnson retains full autonomy, no corporate interference." The cameras exploded with light. Zoe gasped. Children cheered. Lucas's face glowed brighter than ever. Diana stood frozen, her chest tight with disbelief. Richard Montgomery, the man who had once ordered his son to sit down and shame me, had just declared war on his own indifference. And that was only the beginning.